Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. I am thankful in particular to the person who are attending this seminar in presence, so the director of the Center for Hellenic Studies, Martino, for making this event possible. I am very grateful to the institution and to the persons who are making this possible. So I'm also thankful to Zoe Lapis and our Olivia Anderson, lecturer, who are supporting us with this seminar. Thank you very much for the people who are joining us via Zoom, and I hope that this seminar is going to be both informative and, if possible, also entertaining, something that is not usually employed to talk about this very interesting topics. So before introducing the various speakers, I would like to say a couple of words about the raison d'etre of this seminar. So Beyond Disciplinary Boundaries, it's almost a cliche on the one hand, and on the other hand, science is not really always a topic in the humanities sector. So why are we talking about these issues with this approach? Well, I would like to break the ice and start with a small anecdote. We were both in Warwick, and the university asked us, what is your philosophical background behind your research? And later on, I'm realizing that, well, the university wanted just to help us, but it was sort of a 50% philosophical, 50% bureaucratical question. So we were supposed to pick a philosopher or some of them and somehow apply one or more theories to our research. And well, that's a stimulating task for me, but I took perhaps the question too seriously. And well, I started my exploration of contemporary philosophies, especially because, like, for instance, many political theorists dealt with also in our faculties. And my personal impression is that even though I really appreciate like a diversity within a philosophical panorama, that many contemporary philosophies are idealistic. And by saying this, I mean, for instance, that sometimes the existence of an external reality is denied, and for instance, the human mind is considered to be a tabula rasa. So these kind of approaches, which are helpful, I wish I had a proof in my pocket, that would be, I mean, handy. I think that that's not the only possible approach. So I became more and more interested in a different philosophical approach, which is materialism, something which we started knowing with, our beloved ancient philosophers, such as Democritus and Epicurus and so on. And of course, once one starts dealing with materialism, it's unavoidable that also science is involved. And well, to be fair, my research is about Galen, so an ancient physician, and I'm almost naturally driven towards a partly scientific approach to our ancient texts. So, well, at some point, a unifying perspective, so well, not really a unified science, but a science that goes towards unification, appeared to me to be the right philosophy for my palate, not just scientifically speaking, so for my professional research, but also for like my personal interests. And well, what's the advantage of having a unifying vision, and what's the advantage of including a scientific perspective within one's analysis? Well, there's another anecdote, but it should be the last one, by Manuel and I again were attending a conference at the John Ryland Library in Manchester, and it was an interesting and pioneering event concerning new technologies employed to read a Syriac palimpsest manuscript of Galen, and where sitting next to each other, at some point we were commenting on a passage, I think from the Simplicum, and she said, well, here the contents are fine, so the passage is perfectly good. And I said, well, the Greek is not really good. And she said, yeah, but the contents are fine. And I said, well, but the Greek is not good. And it was a stalemate. So we employed at least a couple of years just to, accept each other's positions and views and to try and make a synthesis. A couple of years later, though, when we were in Berlin, I think that we really sparkled when we read a passage from the Locis Affectis, and I was all into particles and variants coming from humanistic manuscripts, while Manuela was just counting the number of the muscles of the eye by verifying that the pieces of information provided by Galen corresponded to our modern scientific view of the topic. And well, I think that eventually, after the analysis, everything was fine, both the text and the contents, and we made like we all progressed. The passage was of difficult interpretation. It was being read by our Berlin colleagues, so that was quite stimulating. Also, people here at the CHS know that I have an old little obsession with Thorstein Veblen and his theory of the leisure class. So again, such an author allowed me to opt for a more unifying perspective. Why am I saying this? Because usually Veblen is considered to be a sociologist, for instance, and so people in the sociology departments study by first working in economics, but also know that there are Veblen's goods like a Rolls-Royce or a diamond and so on. And at the same time, he's considered to be a philosopher. He's of great interest to the students of gender studies, and I would say also psychology, at the very least social psychology. And since he adopted an evolutionary approach, it's not entirely uninteresting also maybe for biologists, or at least in people interested in cultural evolution, which is a pioneering approach today, and in 1899 was, absolutely a novelty. In my personal experience, and I think in our own experience, by saying our, I mean the experience of the speakers, having to deal with ancient texts entailed somehow this kind of unifying perspective, since many of our texts, as we shall see in a moment, are precisely scientific ones. By the way, let me add just a short joke. I think that there is not even one so-called canonical work which is dealt with today, so we enjoy being definitely out of all possible literary canons, since, the Antidotes is a fascinating work by Galen, and still I'm not surprised that it wasn't just, read in all schools along with Euripides or Herodotus. So, of course, there are other canons like ancient medicine, ancient science, but again, we are definitely out of all possible literary standards and cliché in this respect. Furthermore, I'm very interested in working together, not just today, for unification of science, because I think that it can be a transformative process. Why am I saying this? Because it is my personal conviction that the division of the disciplines is somehow the result of the division of labor. Again, this is I can see it's my materialistic approach who's talking now, and my point is if there's a society which is unequal, hierarchical, and this is the kind of knowledge which is produced, I wonder what's going to happen when intellectuals having at least a partial autonomy start working on specific problems by combining their approach. I'm sure that this is going to produce changes and innovation, hopefully for the best. Finally, well, I must confess, many of the speakers have been invited today because it's been only through the dialogue with them that I managed to understand things that were definitely unclear to me, even obscure, when I started dealing with the Antiquities as a classical philologist, because that's my official training. Well, you might remember that I was just, well, let's care about the manuscripts. I love like some linguistic issues, but I wasn't really into the pharmacological side of the work. And I was wrong. There is no good textual criticism without a proper understanding of the topics discussed within a work. It might seem another cliche, but unfortunately, it is a cliche which is put into practice by many scholars. And well, therefore, this dialogue is precious. Also, when I talk with mathematicians, for instance, we have 3 of them among the speakers. Well, I realized that there are different practices in different scientific communities, and I mean, it's hard not to learn something. Let me stress that a dialogue between humanists, I'm partly kidding, just is a nice umbrella term, and scientists, another huge term, well, is possible, but it's not really frequent in university. And again, this happens because after all, we have to publish articles that are very specific, that belong to certain sectors, and this helps us with our career. But it also somehow affects our understanding of the topics we study and of the world that surrounds us. So I'm quite happy to say that there are other places in which such dialogues can happen. For instance, I happened to know all the 3 mathematicians who were presenting today at Todomodo, which is a bookstore in Rome and a small piece of paradise within a concrete jungle. I really hope that today it can be just a small brick that can help us construct this collaborative and interdisciplinary building. Because again, if such a dialogue is possible in a bookstore on the periphery of Rome, I'm quite sure that interesting discussions can go on and on, even within universities. And I also think that, but we will see examples of this in our presentations, that also scientists can benefit from such a dialogue. So after this, hopefully not too much rhetorical introduction, let me please introduce you quickly all of our speakers, and I will leave the floor to Costanza de Martino in a minute. So, well, I get started with her. Costanza is, she will find herself better, but she comes from the theological corner. And as we shall see, she's dealing with an ancient scientific text. And although that text has already received a critical edition, and she works on Philumenus On Venomous Animals, the text was edited in the Corpus Medicorum Graecorum series. Well, nevertheless, new, fresh philological research can definitely improve our understanding of certain topics. Since I think I talked too much, and there will be time to introduce little by little all of our speakers, if Costanza is ready, I think that I can leave the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Simone, for having organized this very original seminar. It's definitely something new. And then for inviting me and let me be part of these. What I'm going to show you today is basically, is on the philological side of this spectrum that we are profiling today. And let's say that these are the main results of my doctoral research, which, as Simone already mentioned, basically consists in providing a new critical edition of this work, which has been transmitted under the name of Philumenus and bears the title of On Venomous Animals. What I hope to demonstrate, let's make a short spoiler, is that, of course, this is going to be philological, but I think on a broadened perspective, it might be a good example to see how the tools that we use to assess something strongly impact the final statement that we make. And with this premise, let's move back to Philumenus, which is probably not that much known. So first thing first, and let's say that Philumenus was, of course, a physician, but we do not know much about him, since no evidence has been transmitted to us on his biography or on his practice as a physician. So his chronology is, let's say, inferred conjecturally. And the conjectures made mostly by Diels and Wellmann, two philologists very well known in the last century, based on the fact that Philumenus in his work mentions a series of physicians who lived till the 2nd century after Christ, and that Philumenus in his turn is then quoted by later physicians in their own works, so that a time span can be established going from the 2nd to the 3rd century after Christ, which should be a chronology fair enough where to place Philumenus. This would also account for a small detail, which is not that meaningless though, which is the fact that Philumenus seems to ignore the much more famous physician of the time, that is Galen. And Galen, in his turn, seems to ignore Philumenus. So, assuming that they are contemporary, might answer this reciprocal ignorance, let's say. As far as it regards where Philumenus practiced as a physician, we have some more conjectures, not facts, but still they can be substantiated with some observation, because his main work, the one that we will see on venomous animals, is part of a very, let's say, of a very fashionable trend within ancient toxicology, which is now referred to as iology, from ios, poison in Greek, which dates back traditionally to Alexandria of Egypt. And this has an impact also on the sources used by Philumenus, which are in some cases quite rare, so that the conjecture was made that he had at his disposal the Alexandria of Egypt library. So these are the reasons why Diels and Wellmann thought he lived and practiced in Alexandria. But let's move from conjectures to facts. So what do we read today by Philumenus? Not that much, frankly, but a further distinction has to be made here between what we read directly and what we read indirectly. So indirectly, we have more than 40 fragments scattered through these later compilers. You see them listed here: Oribasius, Aetius of Amida, and Alexander Trallianus. The three of them lived between the 4th and the 6th century after Christ. And in their medical encyclopedias, as they are referred to normally, they quote Philumenos quite often on different topics. So from this indirect tradition, we can say that Philumenos basically dealt with different diseases, going from female diseases, so many fragments deal with gynecological problems, to fevers, intestinal ones, some are dealing with ophthalmology. But curious enough is the fact that none of these fragments deals with venomous animals. So in the indirect tradition, there's no trace of Philumenos' interest in toxicology. We can have an idea of what he did in this field of pharmacology only to the direct tradition. And here things get a bit more complicated, also because direct tradition of Philumenos, that means actual manuscript transmitting his work, are very few, not to say just one. So the evidence on this discourse on venomous animals is really just limited to this one manuscript now at the Vatican Library in Rome, and which is going to be the focus of the entire paper, basically. This manuscript, so the Vaticanus Graecus 284, was written between the 10th and the 11th century in Constantinople, and transmits Philumenos' text on the pages from 264 to 287. These are pages towards the end of the manuscript. What I have put here is the very first page of the section transmitting Philumenos, where you can see a sort of index, so a table of content is given. And I chose to show this page for two reasons. First of all, because as we will see in a moment, the title at the very beginning of the page is a bit puzzling. And then because giving a synopsis of the content, we might have a clear idea of what a treatise on venomous animals basically consisted of. So this title is puzzling because it says, it just says ex abrupto, chapters on venomous animals and their remedies from Philumenos' work, which clearly suggests that we are not having in the following pages the entirety of Philumenos' work on venomous animals, but rather a selection of chapters from it. And this makes it even more important to see what chapters then have been copied in this manuscript. These are, at the very beginning, first chapters on the mad dog. Because, yes, in antiquity they thought that rabies was basically a typical venom the dog could develop. In fact, at the end we have here a chapter on non-rabid dog, so what to do if a normal dog bites you, and then a longer section on general remedies. In this case too, we can make a distinction between, let's say, prophylactic remedies, such as fumigations and ointments to use in order to keep venomous animals away, and after bite remedies, which the physician should resort to in case his patient has already been bitten by any venomous animals. After that, we have a couple of chapters on insects. So we find here bees, wasps, mosquitoes, flies, and so on. Then scorpions. Then venomous spiders, they are called phalangia in Greek. And then the longest section, which is also the more interesting one, I think, on snakes. So many species of snakes are listed for the rest of the text, going from very common species such as the viper to almost fantastic creatures. We also have the basilisk, for example, and we will go back on that. Okay, this said, so having this idea of the content of Philumenus' work, we have to zoom out a bit to go back on the Vaticanus Graecus 284. Because if we look at this manuscript in its entirety, so from page 1 to page 288, let's pretend to use this manuscript as a book we want to consult, realize that this is, as I wrote here, a pharmacological handbook, in the sense that the subjects covered within it are very consistent one with the other, covering all the branches ancient pharmacology consisted of. In fact, we find materia medica at the beginning, which means a very informative list of all the substances, animal, vegetables, minerals, that one can use to prepare compound medicines. The second section on poisons deals with the substances which, once ingested, might intoxicate who ingested them. Then we have what is of interest for us, so the venomous animals, what happens to people who got bitten or stung by a scorpion or a snake. And finally, a very short section on the practical side of pharmacology, which is recipes of how to make some compound antidotes. We see that for each section, the redactor, so this figure, which at one point created this handbook, made accurate choices. For his materia medica, he decided to compile and to cover this branch of pharmacology with Galen simples. But quite interestingly, he left aside book 1 to 5, which are the most the theoretical part of Galen's work, and just kept book 6 to 11, which is the proper list of all the substances which might be employed in pharmacy. And as you can see, this covers a huge section of the manuscript, going from page 1 to page 251. For poisons, our redactor chose another author, which is this Alexipharmaca, falsely attributed to Dioscorides, which were at some point added to Dioscorides' work and considered his book sixth. Let's remember that Dioscorides' Materia Medica is constituted by 5 books. After this, for the venomous animals, he chose our dear Philumenus, so the 37 chapters that we have just seen. And finally, at the very last pages, he just put this very famous Mithridaticum, which is a quite complex antidote. Another one, and then just an excerpt, which is on cinnamon. So far, so good. But if we then check each section on the micro level, so on the textual micro level, we see that this editorial project is much more complicated than we thought. Because this redactor, this person who wanted this handbook, who wanted to create this handbook, wanted it to be as complete as possible, which means that for each section, he wanted to gather in one single book all the information available at the point. And he has even stated that clearly. So, for example, here, the page that you see is the very last of the section on Materia Medica, and he has written at the end a remark explaining what he did in the previous pages. And he says, the 11th book of Galen Simples, so the last one, has been completed, containing from Dioscorides all that Galen had omitted. Which means that all the information that he did not find in Galen, he took it from Dioscorides and added it to Galen. But how did this happen? This happened in a very accurate way, and we can see that if we pick a chapter and analyze it textually. I took the one on river crabs because this is a remedy which was used against hydrophobia, so it's very much employed in counteracting rabid dogs. And in this case, the chapter is the one you see on the page. If you compare it with the sources our redactor has used, you see that the orange parts basically corresponds to Dioscorides, whereas the green one corresponds to Galen. As you can see, this is not a mere juxtaposition of sources. He has very intricately mingled them together. He has created a synthesis of the two, providing thus a very useful tool, because then one didn't need to read anything else apart from this. He had everything in there. All the information he could look for on river crabs were contained in this chapter. And this, of course, is just an example. You can broaden the same to almost the entire section on materia medica. Let's move now to the second section, so the one on poisons. As I said, in this case, the redactor picked these alexipharmaca falsely attributed to Dioscorides, and which were considering them, and we'll see it shortly, authentic Dioscorides. In fact, before copying this work on poisons, he has left another remark, which you see highlighted here in yellow, where he basically goes on commenting his modus compilandi, so how he has decided to plan this handbook he's making. And in this case, he says, after incorporating into Galen simples the powers and types of ointments and wines from Dioscorides' 5 books, this is the Materia Medica, that were omitted by Galen, so again, the criterion is repeated, which we saw also at the end of the previous book, I consequently found it necessary to add the 6th book of Dioscorides, after the copy of the 11 books, following only what Dioscorides himself says. So it's clear what happened here. He didn't have at his disposal any other source on poisons, and he states clearly that it's because of that he has just selected pseudo-Dioscorides, which he calls Dioscorides, alexipharmaca, to cover this second branch of pharmacology, poisons. Why is not working any longer? Okay. Third section. In this third section, we finally get to the venomous animals. And the page that you see here is basically the very second one. So on the left, you had the index that I showed you before. In fact, this is the end of the column on the index. And in conformity with what we have seen so far, so with these remarks, self-commenting his work, also on this page, before starting the copy of the work itself, the redactor has left a remark where he says, it seemed to me appropriate and useful to also add to this book the discourse on the mad dog and venomous animals, written in different books by the ancients, and this is it. What do we learn here? That basically, for his section on venomous animals, the redactor used at least 2 sources, one on the mad dog and one on venomous animals. Of these 2, one has to be Philumenus, since the title on the previous page clearly stated that chapters are taken from Philumenus. So the question is, who is the second source he used, and for which part? Now, a small spoiler, the best candidate for being the second source is another work falsely attributed to Dioscorides, which is referred to as Theriaca, and which also entered Dioscorides' work at one point as book 7. It's important to say here that knowing that our redactor for sure had the first 6 books, because he has used the first 5 for implementing Galen within the first section. He has used the book 6 for his second section. Is very likely that he also had book 7 at his disposal on venomous animals, and that this is the second source that he used to implement Philumenos. But this said, so bearing this in mind, let's see how we can assess if Dioscorides is the second source, not having any other witness transmitting Philumenos text apart from this manuscript here. We have to look at Philumenos on venomous animals in direct tradition. So an author who used Philumenos on venomous animals to compile his own book on venomous animals. And this is the already met Aetius of Amida, who in his book 13 largely relies on Philumenos as a source. If, in fact, we compare Aetius 13 with the chapters we have in our Vatican manuscript on venomous animals, we see that from chapter 1 to chapter 45, he basically overlaps with our chapters 5 to chapter 37. So what is missing is precisely the section on the mad dog, which corresponds to chapter 1 to 4, as we saw in the index. So the question is, where do chapters 1 to 4, that is the section on the mad dog, come from? And bearing in mind that Dioscorides was available to our redactor within the same book where book 6 and book 1 to 5 were transmitted, a comparison with this work kind of confirms that this is the second source. In fact, chapter 1 to 4 in the Vatican manuscript almost completely overlap with Dioscorides chapter 1 to 3. So we can assess with a certain grade of certainty that what our redactor did is taking these first chapters on the mad dog from Dioscorides and adding them in front of Philumenos' work, which corresponds to the remaining part of the work. So actually, chapters 1 to 4 are Dioscorides, chapter 5 to 37 are Philumenos. And this is why Aetius only corresponds to Philumenos, because Aetius never used Dioscorides and never used this handbook we are dealing with, but the original Philumenos, which we probably do not have any longer. Yet, another analysis of a small chapter indicates that what we saw in the Materia Medica section actually applies also in this case. That means that it's not only on a macro level, so in the structure, that our redactor has mingled two sources, but rather also on a microtextual level. So if you compare in this chapter on the basilisk, the section that you find highlighted in orange, with Aetius 1334 on the basilisk, you see that they are completely overlapping, indicating that this has to be Philumenos. Whereas the final sentence, the one you see in green, corresponds to Dioscorides Theriaca 35. So again, the criterion of the redactor was adding all the information that he did not find in Philumenos, also for other venomous animals, in this case the basilisk, taking them from Dioscorides Theriaca. And this applies to almost all the chapters on venomous animals beyond the mad dog. We assuming at one point a pharmacological handbook was created. You see it indicated here as phi, where somebody created a synthesis between Dioscorides and Philumenos. And today, not having the original Philumenos, we can only use Aetius of Amida to trace back what belongs to Philumenos within that handbook. Because, of course, what comes from Dioscorides can be traced back directly, because we do have it. Whereas what is taken from Philumenos, not having these, has to be mapped back through Aetius of Amida. Yet our story doesn't end, but I am approaching the conclusion, because within the Vaticanus Graecus, some more portions can be found of text which do not match any of the sources that we have mentioned so far. So these sections in the text do not belong to Dioscorides and do not belong to Aetius of Amida. So they must be later additions made to the pharmacological handbook by the users of the handbook. Here I have put a easy example. This page is taken from the Materia Medica section. And as you can see in the round orange circle, somebody, so an anonymous user of this handbook, at one point wrote in the margin that en allo, so in another book, he found different quantities for the same recipes. Which means, and this being in the margin, this is clearly identifiable as an addition. It's what we do while studying or preparing exams, taking some more bibliography and adding small notes in the margins. But in this case, it's easy because that's, as I said, it's in the margin, it's clearly a note. What does it happens if these notes slip into the text and are not detectable any longer as additions? I took in this case an example from the section on venomous animals. This is the chapter on a snake called Ammodiutes. And in this case, we see that somebody at one point, so another anonymous user probably, added, as I found in another book, again, Os de en allo euron, therapy and remedies against Cerastes, Ammodiutes, and Seps are the same. The symptoms induced by the bite of these three species are in fact the same. Reading through the text, this would never be detectable as an addition, since it's perfectly fine with what precedes and with what follows. And more importantly, if without having another manuscript, so another text just transmitting Philumenos, it would be very difficult to recognize this as an extraneous portion of text. So what we do, having just this as a text transmitting Philumenos, and more importantly, should we just focus on the fact that Philumenos is only transmitted by this manuscript? What I want to say is that, and here I'm approaching really the conclusion, that it's exactly within this stratification, these layers left by the many users, anonymous users during over time, that the richness of this handbook lies. Because in adding their notes, both by experience or taking them from other books, these users became co-authors. So if we now just think as the first editor of this edition, Wellmann, this witness as an important source of evidence for Philumenos, we take the risk of forgetting or just not seeing all the other authors having contributed to this piece of text that we have in front of us. And first of all, we would lose the profile of this redactor, who did create a very useful and informative tool, and to what the redactor created for his readers, all the readers' contributions. That is the notes they added, and at one point were useful to some readers who might have become other users. And this said, I hope it was not too confusing the very end of it, but I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.